April 1945. Somewhere along the Rhine, in a former schoolhouse stripped bare by months of shelling, a temporary American POW infirmary breathes in the cold morning air. Frost still clings to the broken windows. The war is almost over, but inside these walls, the struggle for the living continues. An American Army Nurse Corps lieutenant kneels beside a cot made of scavenged wood and canvas. On it lies a young German woman, thin, shivering, her hands trembling from malnutrition rather than fear. She is not a soldier, not in the way the front understood the term. She had been swept into the collapse of the Reich, taken into custody with thousands of other displaced women. Now she is a prisoner of war. The nurse checks her fever with a practiced calm, her breath visible in the chill. Around them, more cots fill the hall, rows of exhausted faces, wounded bodies, and silent questions. The groans of the sick mingle with the distant rumble of American trucks bringing in yet more prisoners. For a moment, the German woman opens her eyes. Enemy and caregiver meet without words, and in that quiet exchange, a story begins. One shaped not by rifles or orders, but by hands that healed. By the final months of 1944, the European continent was staggering under the weight of a collapsing Reich. The Allied advance had broken through Normandy, swept across France, and pushed deep into Western Germany. Cities burned, roads clogged with refugees, and military order dissolved into chaos. In this turmoil, thousands of German women, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, factory workers, and civilians swept up during forced evacuations, found themselves caught between the front line and captivity. The American Army, moving faster than its own logistical system could comfortably support, suddenly confronted a new and unexpected challenge: caring for women officially classified as prisoners of war. Many had been attached to military units, communications posts, anti-aircraft batteries, or supply depots. Others were simply in the wrong place when German formations collapsed and were taken into custody alongside combatants. Under the Geneva Convention, the U.S. military was obligated to provide medical care to all POWs, regardless of gender or allegiance. But no one had anticipated the sheer volume of non-combatant women who would appear in the final rush toward Germany's surrender. In the winter of 1944-45, American field hospitals and evacuation units, originally designed to treat wounded GIs, began receiving not only injured Allied soldiers, but civilians, displaced persons, and eventually German women in uniform or near-uniform roles. The Army Nurse Corps, already strained after months of treating the wounded from Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, and the Battle of the Bulge, now faced a moral and logistical dilemma. These nurses had trained for warfare, but not for tending enemy women who arrived frightened, starving, and sometimes indoctrinated to believe their captors would treat them with brutality. The grim reality was that many of these women entered captivity in desperate condition. Endless retreat had left them malnourished, exhausted, and often ill. Some had marched for days without food, attempting to flee the advancing Soviets only to fall into American hands. Others had been stationed in rear-line facilities struck by Allied bombing campaigns. Their injuries varied: shrapnel wounds, frostbite, untreated infections, burns, and diseases that spread easily in crowded shelters. For many, captivity was not their greatest fear. Dying before the war ended was. American medical officers quickly realized that standard POW camps were insufficient for this influx. Makeshift infirmaries sprang up inside commandeered schools, barns, factories, and abandoned barracks. Nurses often worked with what they could salvage: blankets taken from destroyed homes, cots fashioned from planks, and medical supplies stretched far beyond their intended limits. The task was immense, and yet, in the eyes of the law and the expectations of the international community, these women were entitled to the same care as any wounded soldier. Not all American personnel welcomed this responsibility. Some questioned why resources were being diverted to care for the enemy at all, especially while battles still raged. Others, having lost friends in combat or witnessed atrocities in newly liberated areas, carried deep anger. But the nurses, bound by training, ethics, and a sense of duty that transcended nationality, approached the task with clinical steadiness. They cleaned infected wounds, treated fevers, distributed rations, and monitored German women with the same attention they gave to their own troops. In these strained early days, they noticed something unexpected. Many of the German women entered captivity carrying an intense fear of Americans, fear shaped by years of propaganda that painted Allied forces as brutal invaders. Some POW women refused food at first, believing it to be poisoned. Others recoiled from medical procedures, convinced they were being harmed. But gradually, through routine care and the predictable rhythm of medical discipline, that fear began to erode. This shift occurred quietly, in corridors lit by lanterns and in rooms thick with disinfectant. The nurses were often the first Americans these POW women had ever spoken to, the first to touch them without hostility. Their presence challenged everything the prisoners had been taught. And as more women entered the camps, the need for structured medical support grew more urgent, pushing the U.S. military to formalize systems that would define the months ahead. What unfolded within these improvised infirmaries was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. No battlefield charges, no roaring artillery. But it was pivotal. It revealed the softer, less discussed front of the war, the one where compassion and policy intertwined, where healing became an unexpected instrument of stability. This was the environment into which American nurses stepped, an environment shaped by collapse, uncertainty, and the slow, steady emergence of human contact between those who had once been enemies. And as the flow of German POW women continued to rise, a deeper context took shape around the camps themselves, setting the stage for more complex encounters that would soon follow. By early 1945, the improvised nature of POW care could no longer keep pace with the growing tide of captives. The collapse of the German front created a humanitarian surge unlike anything American planners had expected. Entire columns of prisoners, soldiers, support staff, and civilians absorbed into military formations moved westward under U.S. Guard. Among them were increasing numbers of German women, many wearing auxiliary uniforms of the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht communications units, Red Cross affiliates, or other paramilitary organizations. Others arrived simply as displaced civilians swept into custody for their own protection, or because military authorities could not immediately classify them. The camps varied widely in structure and capacity. Some were temporary enclosures of barbed wire and watchtowers. Others resembled small towns, with barracks converted into orderly compounds. But no matter the layout, all faced the same problem. There was no standard protocol for handling large populations of female POWs. American officers relied heavily on the Army Nurse Corps, whose members became the bridge between military order and human need. Hospital tents and converted buildings formed the medical centers within these camps. Their interiors were stark, wooden floors scrubbed clean, metal basins steaming with boiled instruments, cots arranged in symmetrical rows. The smell of iodine, alcohol, and damp wool hung in the air. Here, German women first confronted the surprising reality of American medical care. Many were treated not in isolation from male prisoners, but in separate wards within the same facility, reinforcing the principle that medical needs superseded political distinctions. The conditions in which these women arrived varied from alarming to dire. Malnutrition was nearly universal. Many women had endured months of rationing, and some had fled from the East with nothing but the clothes they carried. Their bodies bore the markers of prolonged deprivation: sunken cheeks, fragile skin, weakened immune systems. Respiratory infections spread quickly during winter marches. Lice infestations were common, often leading to secondary complications. Frostbite, especially among women who had walked or worked outdoors in the final winter of the war, required urgent intervention. American nurses documented these conditions in detailed reports. Their notes described the physical state of the women, but also captured the emotional atmosphere inside the wards. Some POW women arrived withdrawn, staring silently at the ceiling, speaking only when addressed. Others tried to bargain for better treatment, not realizing that under American procedures they would receive care regardless of rank or history. A few arrived defiant, unwilling to accept help from the enemy. But even the defiant ones eventually faced the reality that they relied on those same nurses for survival. The U.S. military command recognized that neglecting POW women would not only violate international law, but also undermine stability within the camps. Medical leadership therefore instituted standardized screening, isolation wards for infectious diseases, and structured feeding programs. American nurses taught German women basic sanitation practices, hand-washing protocols, how to clean wounds properly, and how to recognize early signs of infection. These instructions were not merely about health. They empowered the women to take part in their own recovery and reduce the workload on overwhelmed Allied medical teams. Within these wards, cultural collisions unfolded daily. The American nurses, accustomed to a more egalitarian and professionalized view of women in service, were often surprised by the rigid expectations some German POW women carried from their former roles. Many expected male doctors to make all decisions and viewed female nurses as subordinate. What they encountered instead were American women who held authority, directed treatments, and made critical medical decisions. This inversion of expectations unsettled some POW women, but impressed others, leaving a lasting imprint as they began to imagine a Germany rebuilt on different social assumptions. Despite the tensions, the interactions remained grounded in necessity. Nurses had to act quickly, triaging patients based on severity rather than history. German women had to trust caregivers who spoke a different language and came from a culture they had been taught to distrust. And yet, the system worked. Mortality rates among POW women treated in American-run facilities were dramatically lower than those in areas where medical care was scarce or improvised. As weeks passed, patterns of cooperation formed. Some German women with medical training, former midwives, clinic assistants, or Red Cross volunteers, were enlisted to help care for other prisoners. Under supervision, they distributed supplies, cleaned wards, and assisted with basic treatments. These arrangements not only relieved the burden on American nurses, but also restored a sense of purpose to women who had lost nearly everything. Inside these camps, the boundaries between prisoner and caregiver softened slightly, not through sentimentality, but through the steady rhythm of routine. Every bandage changed, every fever lowered, every meal distributed created a small but significant shift in perception. The war outside was still raging, but inside these wards, another story was forming. One grounded in survival, medicine, and an unexpected form of human exchange. And as this quiet transformation unfolded, the broader picture of how American nurses shaped the lives of German POW women began to take shape through several distinct angles that defined their interactions. The first and most immediate layer of this story is profoundly human. When American nurses stepped into the makeshift infirmaries filled with German POW women, they encountered individuals who had been shaped by a lifetime of propaganda, fear, and wartime hardship. Many prisoners arrived expecting cruelty. Years of Nazi messaging had painted the Allies, especially Americans, as violent, undisciplined enemies who would show no mercy. This expectation hung in the air like a shadow over every interaction. Yet, what the women met instead were calm voices, steady hands, and a discipline that contradicted everything they had been told. The nurses did not approach their patients with triumph or contempt. They approached with professionalism. They cleaned wounds, measured pulses, wrapped frostbitten feet, and distributed medicine with the detached focus of people who had seen the worst the war could offer, and were determined not to let the suffering spread. For many German women, this care triggered a quiet unraveling. Some broke down the first night, overwhelmed by relief. Others wept silently after realizing they would not be harmed. There were moments when a simple gesture, a warm blanket, a bowl of soup, a brief smile, erased months of fear. These human interactions softened the rigid lines between enemy and caretaker. Gradually, a fragile trust formed, not out of sentimentality, but out of consistent humane treatment. In the eyes of many POW women, the Americans reshaped what enemy meant. And as that shift took root, deeper layers began to emerge. The conditions inside many POW intake zones were breeding grounds for disease. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Crowded quarters helped illness spread. Exposure during winter marches left many women vulnerable to pneumonia, trench foot, and frostbite. American nurses entered this environment trained in battlefield medicine, triage, wound management, emergency stabilization. But the POW wards presented a different challenge: sustained, preventative care on a massive scale. Typhus and dysentery were constant threats. The Army Medical Department prioritized hygiene, enforcing protocols that many prisoners had never experienced before. Nurses taught basic sanitation, cleaning utensils, washing hands before meals, boiling water when possible. They inspected barracks for infestations, oversaw delousing procedures, and enforced quarantine zones when symptoms appeared. These practices were not glamorous, but they saved countless lives. The contrast between American medical standards and the improvisational care many German women had relied on during wartime shortages was stark. In some ways, the POW hospitals became the first place many German women experienced modern, structured medical treatment. Pregnant POWs received prenatal attention. Cases of untreated fractures were properly set. Infections that had progressed for weeks were brought under control. The mortality rate among German POW women in U.S.-run facilities remained significantly lower than in areas without such organized medical care, a testament to the effectiveness of the nurses' work. But medicine was never just science inside these camps. For the nurses, every patient represented a decision to uphold standards in the face of exhaustion, grief, and the memory of their own countrymen still fighting at the front. These choices formed the backbone of their contribution. Behind the compassion lay a practical dimension. The U.S. military understood that stable, healthy POW populations reduced unrest, violence, and resource strain. Disorder in the camps could hinder the movement of troops, complicate supply lines, and damage America's international reputation. Treating POW women with professionalism was strategically beneficial as well as ethically required. American nurses became essential to this administrative stability. Their competence helped maintain order inside the hospitals, which in turn influenced broader camp morale. A treated fever meant a calmer ward. A healed foot meant fewer disruptions. An organized distribution of medicine meant a more predictable population. These efficiencies were noted by military commanders, who often relied on nurse reports to assess camp conditions. Furthermore, the humane treatment of German POW women supported diplomatic objectives. The Allies were preparing for the political reconstruction of Europe. Demonstrating adherence to the Geneva Convention strengthened the United States' global standing and differentiated its post-war vision from the brutality of totalitarian regimes. The presence of American nurses, symbolic and practical, reinforced this message in every camp where they served. Thus, the medical care given to German POW women was not only an act of empathy but also an extension of wartime strategy, blending administrative necessity with humanitarian duty. Inside the wards, the psychological dimension of captivity unfolded in subtle but powerful ways. Many German women carried deep emotional scars: fear of Allied soldiers, fear of Soviet retribution, fear of being judged for their roles in the war. Some struggled with shame. Others clung to fragments of ideology that collapsed as the Reich disintegrated. American nurses often became the first stabilizing presence in this emotional landscape. Their consistent routines, morning assessments, medication rounds, quiet words of reassurance, created a sense of normalcy in a world that had lost all structure. Prisoners who had arrived tense and guarded gradually began asking questions. Some wanted to know about America. Others simply wanted to understand why they were being treated with kindness. Nurses did not offer therapy. They offered presence. But presence alone was transformative. It allowed POW women to step out of the psychological confines of wartime indoctrination and confront a more nuanced reality. Over time, many came to view the nurses not as adversaries, but as professionals performing a duty that transcended national conflict. And it was within this psychological shift that the seeds of deeper transformation began to take hold, setting the stage for additional angles that revealed even more about the relationship between American nurses and the POW women under their care. Warfare reveals a society's values most clearly at its edges, where rules strain, tempers fray, and choices are made without glory. In the final months of World War II, American nurses found themselves navigating a moral terrain that few military manuals had prepared them for. It was one thing to care for wounded comrades. It was another to care for women who wore the insignia of the regime that had devastated Europe. Some nurses admitted to experiencing hesitation when they first stepped into a POW ward filled with German women. Memories of bombed cities, stories of concentration camps beginning to surface, and the deaths of American soldiers weighed heavily on their minds. Yet the ethos of the Army Nurse Corps was clear. All wounded were to be treated according to medical need. No exceptions. This moral framework, applied consistently and without spectacle, became a powerful force. It countered the logic of vengeance. It challenged the zero-sum mentality that total war often produced. By treating POW women humanely, American nurses upheld principles that, in wartime, could easily have been abandoned. The nurses understood that their actions reflected not just on themselves, but on the nation they represented. Every interaction reinforced a larger statement about the United States' commitment to law, order, and human dignity. In this sense, their work extended beyond healing bodies. It quietly shaped the moral architecture of the post-war world, proving that even amid devastation, compassion could still be operational. Behind every calm ward and orderly line of cots lay a complex network of logistics. American nurses did not operate in isolation. They were part of a vast system designed to maintain structure within collapsing territory. The treatment of POW women was not simply a humanitarian task. It was also a matter of operational necessity. Overcrowding plagued nearly every camp. When large groups of German prisoners surrendered, the camps swelled almost overnight. Without organized medical oversight, sickness could spread rapidly, threatening not only POWs but American guards, cooks, and support staff. Efficient medical care, triage, quarantine procedures, sanitation enforcement was essential to preventing outbreaks that could cripple an entire facility. American nurses became the backbone of this preventative system. They moved between wards, recorded symptoms, identified patterns of illness, and sounded early alarms when disease threatened to spread. Their reports often shaped command decisions: when to open new quarantine areas, when to increase rations, when to adjust camp layouts to reduce contact between vulnerable groups. Additionally, the presence of female medical professionals helped maintain order among female POWs. Many prisoners responded with greater cooperation when treated by women, especially regarding sensitive medical issues. This dynamic reduced tension, minimized disciplinary incidents, and fostered an atmosphere where rules could be enforced with less force. In operational terms, American nurses brought stability during a moment when chaos seemed inevitable. Their work kept thousands alive and kept the logistical machinery of the occupation running. Perhaps the most subtle yet enduring angle was cultural. German POW women entered captivity with societal norms shaped by years of authoritarian rule and deeply traditional gender expectations. In contrast, American nurses embodied a different vision of womanhood: independent, professional, and empowered within the military hierarchy. This cultural contrast played out in everyday interactions. German women were often surprised to see American nurses issuing orders to male medics, or confidently making medical decisions that carried authority. In the Reich's system, women were expected to serve, never to lead, especially in military settings. Seeing women in positions of responsibility challenged assumptions many POWs had absorbed since childhood. Conversely, American nurses learned about the wartime experiences of German women, stories of factory labor under aerial bombardment, shortages that strained families, and the psychological pressures of living in a society at total war. These exchanges, often conducted in fragments of broken English and improvised translation, created moments of unexpected understanding. Some German women later recalled that their first glimpse of a different future came in the wards of POW hospitals, watching American women work with a confidence and professionalism that hinted at possibilities beyond the rigid roles they had known. The nurses did not set out to reshape cultural norms, yet by doing their jobs, they became examples of another way to navigate the world, one grounded in capability rather than obedience. These cultural impressions would linger long after the war ended, carried home by thousands of women as Germany began rebuilding from the ground up. And as these angles converged, they set the stage for the decisive turning point, when overwhelming crisis forced American nurses and German POW women into a moment that would define their relationship in the closing days of the war. By April 1945, the war in the West was collapsing with astonishing speed. Entire German armies were falling apart within days. The Ruhr Pocket, one of the last major concentrations of German forces, cracked under pressure, and tens of thousands streamed toward American lines to surrender. Among them were hundreds of women, auxiliary staff, communications personnel, drivers, medical orderlies, and civilians swept up in the chaos. It was a human tide that no American field manual had adequately prepared for. The POW camp strained beyond capacity. Barracks meant for 200 held 4 times that number. Mess halls became triage centers, yards turned into temporary shelters, and in the center of this overwhelming influx stood the American nurses, confronted with their greatest challenge of the war. One cold morning in mid-April, trucks rolled into a makeshift compound near the shattered industrial corridor of the Ruhr. Inside were German women, some barefoot, others leaning against one another for support. Many could barely walk. Their uniforms were torn from long marches, their faces hollow from ration scarcity. Some carried children born only weeks earlier. Others clutched personal belongings that amounted to nothing more than a scarf, a dented mug, or a small photograph hidden in a coat lining. When the tailgate dropped, several women collapsed onto the ground. The nurses waiting nearby realized instantly that this was not a routine intake. This was a medical emergency on a scale that threatened to overwhelm the entire camp. The triage began immediately. American medics set up a rapid assessment line, while nurses took the most critical cases to a drafty schoolhouse repurposed as a hospital. Inside, rows of cots stood shoulder to shoulder. Pots of water boiled on field stoves. The steady pace of treatment that had been manageable weeks earlier now accelerated into crisis rhythm. Pneumonia cases arrived in clusters, women who had marched for days through cold rain, coughing blood. Frostbite injuries from the brutal winter demanded amputation in some cases. Lice infestations spread rapidly through the new arrivals, forcing immediate delousing orders. Dehydration, dysentery, and untreated wounds were everywhere. The nurses found themselves moving from one emergency to another without pause. American personnel felt the strain. Supply shortages hit hard, bandages ran low, antibiotics were limited and had to be rationed with painful precision. Even basic disinfectant was precious. Nurses documented every vial used, every tablet given, every fever charted. The line between medical procedure and improvisation blurred. Tension simmered among the guards and support staff. Some questioned why scarce resources were being directed toward the enemy when American units at the front still needed care. But medical command insisted that order depended on treatment. Disease could not be allowed to spread. Human suffering could not be ignored. The Geneva Convention demanded compliance, and conscience demanded it even more. Within this pressure, a defining moment emerged. Late in the afternoon, after hours of unbroken triage, a group of German women were brought in from a nearby town recently struck by Allied bombing. They had been discovered hiding in a cellar, wounded and terrified. Among them was an older woman with severe burns along her arms and neck, injuries that shook even the experienced nurses. As the nurses worked to clean and dress the burns, the woman flinched violently. She believed she was being punished, not treated. Between gasps of pain, she repeated the same broken phrases, fragments of propaganda that had warned her of what Americans would do to German women. Her terror rippled through the ward, unsettling those who watched. The American nurse assigned to her, Lieutenant Eleanor Hughes, did not speak German. She used gestures instead, a steady hand, a quiet voice, a repeated nod of reassurance. Slowly, the woman stopped resisting. Her breathing eased. She cried not from pain, but from the realization that she was being cared for by someone she had been taught to fear. Moments like this spread through the camp, subtle yet powerful. For the nurses, they were reminders of why they had endured the long months of the European campaign. For the prisoners, they shattered the psychological walls built by propaganda and fear. But the crisis was far from over. As more trucks arrived and the wards filled to capacity, American nurses entered a period of non-stop work. They slept only a few hours at a time, sometimes still wearing their field jackets. Meals were taken in hurried bites between patients. Nights echoed with coughing, whispered prayers, and the clatter of medical basins. There were moments when exhaustion blurred the edges of judgment. Nurses sometimes worked through fever themselves, refusing rest because there were simply too many who needed them. They wrote reports with shaking hands. Some cried in private corners of the schoolhouse-turned-hospital. Yet they continued, driven by the conviction that order would collapse if they did not. The crisis of April 1945 became the defining test of the relationship between American nurses and German POW women. It forced both groups into a relentless confrontation with fear, vulnerability, and the raw necessity of survival. And as the situation intensified, the unfolding transformation would reach its breaking point, pushing nurses and prisoners alike into a moment where care became not just treatment, but a bridge between worlds on the verge of peace. The crisis that engulfed the camps in April 1945 did not resolve quickly. What followed was a week of ceaseless strain, a period when the boundaries between night and day blurred and survival depended on discipline as much as medical skill. Yet within this pressure, something profound began to take shape, a transformation that neither the American nurses nor the German POW women could have anticipated. It began with a shift in cooperation. In the early days, many German women were too weak or frightened to assist with even basic tasks. But as the nurses stabilized the most critical cases, some of the recovering prisoners stepped forward. A few had backgrounds in midwifery, first aid, or wartime nursing. Others simply understood that the ward was drowning in need and that helping would improve conditions for everyone. American nurses, recognizing the opportunity, began enlisting these women as auxiliary helpers. Under strict supervision, they distributed blankets, cleaned floors, fetched water, and assisted with feeding those too weak to eat on their own. This cooperation was practical, but its greater impact lay in the way it altered the atmosphere of the infirmary. Instead of a sharp divide between prisoner and caretaker, a fragile shared purpose emerged, keeping the ward alive. One of the most significant breakthroughs occurred when a group of German women volunteered to help sanitize a quarantine area. The task was grueling, scrubbing floors, boiling water, disinfecting bedding. But their willingness to participate set a precedent that spread to the rest of the ward. American nurses saw attitudes shifting in real time. Where fear had once dictated behavior, now understanding began to shape it. Within this environment, trust deepened. The nurses took the time, when minutes allowed, to teach small groups of POW women how to recognize infection, how to apply basic bandaging techniques, and how to maintain personal hygiene under wartime conditions. These lessons were simple, but their impact was enormous. For many German women, it was the first time they had been taught medical skills in a structured and disciplined way. They absorbed the information with an intensity born of necessity. As the days passed, the medical situation began to stabilize. New cases still arrived, but fewer were on the brink of death. The wards remained overcrowded, yet the frantic energy gradually gave way to a rhythm of sustained, focused care. Nurses could finally monitor patients with greater precision, initiating controlled treatment plans rather than constant crisis response. Then came a turning point that rippled through every corner of the camp, the news of Germany's impending collapse and the approach of unconditional surrender. The announcement did not come all at once. It trickled into the camp through guarded conversations, radio transmissions, and the hushed tones of officers who understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. When the nurses learned of it, many felt a mixture of relief and solemnity. For months they had cared for the wounded, while wondering if the war would ever truly end. For the German POW women, the emotional impact was even more intense. Some wept openly, tears of exhaustion, fear for families back home, grief for a nation broken by war. Others sat silently, staring at the floor, trying to reconcile the end of a regime they had been raised to believe was unshakable. The nurses witnessed these reactions with quiet respect. They did not celebrate. They continued working, aware that their role now carried new weight. The war was ending, but the responsibility of care remained. In the days surrounding the surrender, the ward became a place of stillness amid historical upheaval. The sound of artillery faded. The rumble of trucks replaced the roar of battle. And in the infirmary, American nurses continued treating German POW women with the same steadiness they had shown in the darkest moments of the crisis. One episode from this period captured the essence of the transformation. A young German woman, once too frightened to speak, approached Lieutenant Hughes, the same nurse who had tended the older burn victim weeks earlier. In broken English, she offered thanks. She explained that she had survived because of the Americans' calm persistence. She admitted she had feared them more than death itself when she first arrived. Now, she said, she understood that the enemy she had imagined was not the one she met. Such exchanges, though brief and unrecorded in official reports, became part of the lived memory of those who served in the POW infirmaries. For the American nurses, these moments validated months of exhausting work. For the German women, they altered the way they understood not only the enemy, but the world beyond the collapsing Reich. As the surrender became official in early May, the camps shifted into a new phase. Prisoners were now part of a defeated nation, not a fighting force. The role of the American nurses adjusted accordingly. They prepared medical summaries, stabilized patients for transfer, and ensured that women strong enough to leave the ward could enter the next stage of processing. Yet, even as the administrative machinery activated, the nurses recognized that something bigger had happened, something that extended beyond charts, rations, or regulations. In the crucible of crisis, a bond had formed between groups separated by language, ideology, and the violence of war. It was not a bond of friendship, nor a sentimental reconciliation. It was a bond forged through necessity, professionalism, and the shared human experience of suffering and survival. This transformation marked the peak of a journey that had begun with fear and uncertainty months earlier, and as the war officially ended, the aftermath of these encounters would ripple outward, shaping not only the immediate post-war environment, but the future lives of the women who had passed through these American-run infirmaries. The guns fell silent in May 1945, but inside the POW infirmaries, the work continued with the same steady precision. Victory did not erase illness. Peace did not mend frostbitten limbs or heal malnutrition. And the women who had collapsed into American custody during the final months of the war now faced a new reality: recovery in a world that had been irreversibly reshaped. Immediately after the surrender, U.S. military authorities initiated the complex task of reorganizing POW camps. Men and women were separated according to new administrative protocols. Some were designated for rapid release, especially those classified as civilians caught in the collapse. Others, women who had served in official auxiliary roles, remained in custody for formal processing. Through it all, the American nurses remained responsible for the medical continuity that held these fragile populations together. Their wards changed subtly. The frantic pace of emergency triage slowed, replaced by long-term care, nutritional stabilization, treatment for chronic conditions, and medical evaluations that would determine who was healthy enough to leave. Cases of tuberculosis and respiratory damage needed extended attention. Women recovering from frostbite required weeks of observation. Those who had been pregnant during captivity now entered the difficult postpartum period, relying heavily on the nurses' expertise. One of the most immediate consequences of the surrender was psychological. With the Reich gone, many German POW women experienced a profound emotional collapse. The ideology that had once promised security had evaporated overnight, leaving fear, confusion, and guilt in its wake. Some asked the nurses hesitantly about the future, how they would be treated, whether they would be separated from family, what awaited them in the ruins of Germany. The nurses did not have all the answers, but they provided what they could: clarity where possible, reassurance where appropriate, and silence when the truth was simply too uncertain. The nurses' official reports from this period reflected a noticeable shift. Once filled with emergency assessments, they now documented signs of recovery: weight gain, healing wounds, restored mobility. They also tracked the emotional responses of the women, how cooperation increased as fear decreased, how tension inside the wards eased when the threat of renewed fighting disappeared. The atmosphere softened not into friendship, but into something quietly humane. Repatriation began slowly. Trains and trucks organized by Allied forces carried women back to towns and villages that often no longer existed as they remembered. Some returned home to discover that their families had fled, been displaced, or perished. A few remained temporarily in Allied-administered camps because they had nowhere else to go. For those still in need of medical support, the American nurses arranged transfers to more permanent facilities managed by occupation authorities or international relief organizations. Many German women later recalled these final days in American care with surprising clarity. They remembered the structured meals, simple but consistent. They remembered the first time they were given clean clothing after months of hardship. They remembered the tone of the nurses' voices during examinations, firm, calm, never demeaning. Some spoke of the quiet dignity of being treated as a patient rather than a defeated enemy. Others described how the discipline of the wards brought a sense of stability after months of chaos. For the American nurses, the aftermath offered little time for reflection. They were already preparing for new assignments, occupation duties, medical missions, or, in many cases, the long journey home. Their work in the POW wards had been intense, exhausting, and morally challenging, yet many documented in letters and journals that it was also among the most meaningful experiences of their service. As the repatriation process accelerated, a question lingered among commanders and medical personnel alike. What would become of the women who had passed through these American-run infirmaries? How would the care they received influence the rebuilding of their lives, and perhaps the reconstruction of their country? The answers would unfold gradually, carried not in official reports but in the memories and choices of the women who were about to re-enter a devastated Germany. When the first waves of German POW women left American custody and stepped back into the shattered landscape of post-war Germany, their lives did not return to what they had known before. Cities lay in ruins. Transportation networks were crippled. Food was scarce. Families were scattered or gone. Yet among these harsh realities, many carried with them something they had not expected to find in captivity, a memory of care that contradicted the world they had come from. In the months following the surrender, the experiences within American-run infirmaries quietly influenced how these women navigated the uncertainties of occupation. Those who had been taught emergency sanitation, wound management, or basic medical skills often found these abilities became valuable in their home communities, where doctors were scarce and hospitals overwhelmed. Some used what they had learned to aid neighbors and relatives. Others joined local relief groups that formed spontaneously in response to shortages and disease outbreaks. Without intending to, American nurses had equipped hundreds of German women with practical tools for survival in a devastated nation. The emotional impact of their captivity also lingered. For many, the interaction with American nurses challenged deeply ingrained wartime stereotypes. They had expected hostility and brutality. Instead, they found structure, discipline, and a professionalism that left a lasting impression. Over time, this memory played a subtle role in shaping attitudes toward the Allied presence in Western Germany. Former POW women often became intermediaries in their families or local communities, helping others understand that the Americans were not the caricatures portrayed by Nazi propaganda. This quiet cultural shift helped ease tensions in the early months of occupation and laid groundwork for more stable post-war relations. Some of these women later gave statements, informal, often shared within families, describing how the American nurses had changed their perception of the world. They spoke of calm voices during moments of terror, of receiving medical treatment without humiliation, and of witnessing women in positions of authority whose confidence defied the rigid gender norms they had grown up with. In a time when Germany was grappling with its ideological collapse, these impressions offered a glimpse of alternative ways societies could be structured. The American nurses, too, carried their experiences into the post-war world. Many returned home with a new understanding of global responsibility and the human cost of war. Their letters and diaries, some preserved in archives, others in private collections, describe the emotional complexity of caring for the enemy. They wrote of exhaustion, of the moral weight of their duties, of the profound relief when a critical patient survived, and of the quiet satisfaction that came from upholding their professional ethics even when circumstances might have excused anger or resentment. Some nurses went on to serve in the early post-war occupation forces, applying the same principles of care in a Germany struggling to rebuild. Others entered civilian nursing with a stronger conviction in the importance of international humanitarian standards. A few pursued careers in public health, driven by what they had witnessed in the camps, how disease spread quickly through vulnerable populations, how orderly systems saved lives, and how education could transform entire communities. In a broader historical sense, the treatment of German POW women by American nurses contributed to the long-term trajectory of U.S.-German relations. It established a precedent for humane post-war conduct that distinguished the American occupation from harsher approaches elsewhere. It offered a foundation for trust, fragile at first, but gradually strengthened through consistent policy and personal interaction. and it helped lay the psychological groundwork for the eventual integration of West Germany into Western democratic alliances. For the women who lived through it, however, the impact was more personal. It existed in small memories, the warmth of a blanket offered in a freezing ward, the steadiness of hands cleaning a wound, the quiet reassurance of a nurse who did not speak their language but treated them with dignity. These moments did not erase the trauma of war, but they added nuance to a world that had long been framed in absolutes. Decades later, as Germany healed and the post-war generation looked back on the turning points that shaped reconciliation, this little-known chapter of history remained largely unspoken, yet its influence persisted in the lives it touched and the attitudes it reshaped. And within this enduring influence lay a final truth, that even in the aftermath of devastation, human compassion could ripple outward, shaping the future in ways no battlefield victory ever could. In the long shadow of World War II, the story of American nurses and German POW women is easy to overlook. It contains no sweeping offensives, no celebrated heroes, no decisive battlefield maps. Its moments unfolded quietly, in dim hospital wards, along narrow camp corridors, and in the fragile space between fear and trust. Yet it is precisely in such quiet spaces that the deeper legacies of war often take shape. The work of the American nurses did not end the conflict, nor did it erase the suffering the war had inflicted, but it revealed something essential about the nature of humanity under extreme pressure. Faced with exhausted, frightened women who had once belonged to the enemy, the nurses chose steadiness over resentment, discipline over vengeance, and care over contempt. Their actions reaffirmed the principle that moral integrity does not depend on the identity of the patient, but on the character of the caregiver. For the German women who passed through their wards, the experience left an imprint that endured long after the war's ruins were cleared. In a world suddenly stripped of its certainties, the memory of being treated with dignity by those they had been taught to fear became a quiet anchor. It widened their understanding of the world beyond propaganda and helped reshape the first fragile layers of trust on which post-war Europe would be rebuilt. The nurses themselves carried forward the same memory. They returned home, knowing that even in the harshest conditions, small acts of competence and compassion could create unexpected bridges. Their service became part of the understated architecture of post-war healing, a reminder that the aftermath of war depends as much on ordinary people choosing humanity as it does on treaties and political decrees. In the end, the story of how American nurses changed the lives of German POW women is not simply a chapter of medical history or military administration. It is a testament to the enduring truth that even amid devastation, compassion can cut through the divisions of conflict, leaving behind a legacy not measured in victories, but in lives quietly restored.